Ontario's Pay Equity Commissioner Kadie Ward says barriers still need to be dismantled in the women's labor market. In a statement released Monday, Commissioner Ward indicates that the pandemic plays a heavy hand in widening the gender wage gap. April 2020 saw women's participation in the labor force down to the lowest it had been in 30 years. With Tuesday marking International Women's Day, Commissioner Ward says this presents an opportunity not only to celebrate women, but address systemic inequalities that continue to persist. To speak more about this, Commissioner Ward joins us now on Forum Daily. Welcome to Forum Daily, Commissioner Ward.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with what the current state of the Canadian women's workforce is after 2 years of a pandemic.
Well, you mentioned the compelling fact that in April 2020, women's workforce participation fell 50 to 55%, which was the lowest it had been in 30 years. And Ontario itself was no exception. This was seen across Canada. And we've seen some economic recovery over the past 2 years, but recent data from labor force surveys show that in Ontario, at least, unemployment rate for women was around 7.9% in January, up slightly from December, but still it's behind men about 3% during the same period. So from January to December 2021 to 22. So we're still lagging. And it's important to note that with that happening, the gender pay gap still exists in Ontario and in Canada. It's about 11% for both Ontario and Canada right now. So, this signals that women are facing both barriers to employment, but then also once they're in employment, they're facing barriers to equal pay and equal remuneration.
And how does all of this compare to the male workforce and how it was impacted during the pandemic?
Well, interesting question. I mean, we're calling this pandemic a C-session because it's affecting women more. Other organizations are calling it a mom session because it affected working mothers more because of the additional care work. In terms of men, we do see that the impact, working age men, you find that they're bouncing back at a rate that was pre-pandemic. And so there's not as much of an impact. So we're seeing they're bouncing back much quickly. The real issue is still on women and forcing women to leave the labor market because of care work, because the sectors they work in were the hardest hit by the economy in terms of retail, tourism, restaurant service. So a lot of the jobs where men are clustered in remained and grew, where we just didn't see that with female predominated jobs. They were contracting.
And for a broader understanding of the situation, what impact does a gender wage gap have on the overall workforce in Ontario and the economy?
Well, having women in the labor force matters for several reasons, including, well, first, their personal economic well-being and just sort of personal financial stability. But also there's a macroeconomic discussion that needs to be had here. An often cited report by McKinsey estimated that by 2026, Canada could add $150 billion to its GDP by supporting women's participation in the workforce. So getting women up to pre-pandemic levels and up to the same levels as men. The Royal Bank of Canada puts that number at about $100 billion. So we're looking at 150 to 100 billion on the table in GDP that's being left behind. And so, those numbers aren't disaggregated by province, but Ontario would certainly see a significant boost to GDP as well. And, working for the province of Ontario, this is important for me. So we need to look at supporting women's participation in the labor force for the macroeconomic stage of recovery, but also individually. So individuals have opportunity to have economic empowerment. There's women's participation in the labor market has economic benefits and social benefits that really link to income equality, workforce productivity, and increasing households' income. And increasing household income is a really salient fact, given that 50% of the Canadian GDP is driven by household spending, and by household spending is overwhelmingly done by women. So there's an important connection of getting women in the workforce, making and achieving equal pay, because ultimately that pay, that investment goes back into society, back into our economy to strengthen the macro picture and then the micro picture for the individual.
All right, just a really quick 30 seconds left here, ma'am, but what steps can officials take to address these systemic inequalities?
Well, there's a lot of data that shows that diversity in the workplace supports innovation and is supporting businesses bouncing back from the economy from the recession. Ideas and innovation are gender neutral. They appear in men and women, and that's intersectional. So I think business leaders need to look at the breadth and depth of their talent pool and look for ideas across an innovation and really award that innovation with equal pay and equal recognition.
Absolutely, ma'am. Thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
Stay with us. We've got more top stories from around the world coming up next with an update on Ukraine.